Virtue ethics is an approach to ethics that goes back to Plato and Aristotle, so it's got its roots in the ancient Greek philosophy. It's a theory that focuses more on character than actions. So, some of the other theories that we've looked at, say Kantian ethics or utilitarianism, are more interested in the question which actions are right and which actions are wrong, and they try to think of various ways to work that out. Virtue ethics is a bit different. The idea of character is right at the center of the theory, and it's really asking the question, what sort of person should I be? What are the virtues, what are the good qualities that make a good life? And what are the vices or negative qualities that we should avoid? At the heart of virtue ethics is the search for eudaimonia. The Greek word eudaimonia is important in virtue ethics. We can roughly translate this as happiness, or also flourishing, and perhaps in a way flourishing is a better translation. Because this is the kind of happiness or well-being that really comes from a particular kind of character. We could say perhaps it's a happiness that comes from within, from being a particular kind of person. So it's not the kind of happiness you could get, say, from just winning the lottery or getting lucky. It's something to do with what you're bringing to life, the attitudes and character traits that we're bringing to life. So, for instance, patience, courage, temperance, and justice are all seen as virtues. And if you think about it, they're all part of a flourishing life. If you had no patience, it'd be very, very difficult to be happy. You know, even in the most luxurious situations, you'd be getting angry very easily and falling out with people. If you had no courage, you couldn't speak in front of a group. You couldn't ask someone out on a date. You couldn't try anything new. Courage really, in this context, means working with our fear, facing our fear and not letting our fear govern us. And that's certainly a quality that helps us to do well in life, to flourish, and to get on well with others. Temperance is about having a balanced attitude to emotions and appetites, so being quite even-minded, even-tempered as we go through life. And justice in this particular theory of ethics is more to do with the harmony of the soul. It's a virtue that really binds all of the other qualities together, and there's a sense of harmony in the soul of a life worth lived. According to Aristotle, virtue is very much a skill. It's something that we do. It's something that we can learn. And he'd argue that you learn to be virtuous by looking at virtuous people, seeing the way that they do things, seeing the way that they act, and then practicing the virtues, developing the skills, just in the same way that we'd develop the skill of, say, playing a musical instrument. So virtue is a skill. It's something that we learn and develop. Aristotle also talks about three types of people in his virtue ethics. So he describes people who live only for pleasure, and I'm afraid he's a little bit dismissive of them. You say such people live a bovine existence. In other words, they live like a cow. So if you're only seeking pleasure and the absence of pain, then that's not really a way of life Aristotle would respect. And you can already see here there's a criticism of utilitarianism, which of course historically came much later, but a criticism of the kind of position represented by Bentham, that all that matters is pleasure and the absence of pain. Aristotle also talks about honour, people who live for honour, people who live for status, so perhaps politicians finding practical solutions to problems in the world. Highest of all, unsurprisingly perhaps for a philosopher, is the type of person who lives for contemplation, who lives for philosophy. And this, according to Aristotle, is the most flourishing form of life, people who live in that way. Aristotle argues that the virtue is the mean between two extremes. So the virtue is between the two vices. So, for instance, courage would be seen as a kind of midpoint, although not necessarily exactly in the middle, but a kind of midpoint between, on the one hand, being foolhardy, and on the other hand, being very, very cowardly. So if you think of a person who was a firefighter, say, and if they saw a burning building and thought, oh, it looks too hot, I don't fancy doing that, it looks really dangerous, I'm going home, that would obviously be the expression of a cowardly attitude. But somebody who would just run in without putting the proper breathing apparatus on, without liaising with the rest of the team, without taking proper precautions, would just be being foolhardy. There's nothing brave about doing that. So courage is the midpoint. It's the point of virtue, really. So again, in that situation, the person would use the breathing apparatus, follow the instructions, work with the team members, but then, despite the fear involved in a situation, do what could be done in order to help the people in the fire. Similarly, with patience, we could see a person who was totally impatient, just snapping at the slightest thing, being very, very irritable. That's a vice. But also a kind of extreme passivity would also be a vice. So if a person was just a doormat all of their lives, they never stood up for themselves, they never stood up for anybody else, and let themselves get walked over all the time, that wouldn't be the virtue of patience. That would be the extreme of being excessively passive. So again, the virtue lies between two extremes. Like any theory, virtue ethics has its advantages and disadvantages. It takes into account the whole of a person's life, and this, I think, is a real strength. So it's not just saying ethical issues are things we come across very rarely in our lives, as if we wander through life with nothing ethical coming up and suddenly face a decision of whether to help a friend have euthanasia. According to virtue ethics, our whole life is ethical. The way we live in our day-to-day activities expresses our virtue or our vice. Virtue ethics also is a theory that places good emphasis on the emotions. So the emotional life is very much part of our ethical life. The virtuous person doesn't just think or act a particular way. The virtuous person feels a particular way, feels appropriately in different circumstances. Virtue ethics also has certain disadvantages. It's accused of not giving enough guidance on particular moral dilemmas. So unlike utilitarianism or Kantian ethics, it doesn't give us a formula for right action. It doesn't give us an easy way to tell what the right thing is to do. It would say the right thing is what a virtuous person would do. But of course, if we lack that particular virtue, it's not so easy to know what that would be. Virtue ethics is also accused of being relativistic. The idea of what is a virtue may change and may differ from time to time and from place to place, from society to society. And if there's no universal or generally accepted standard of what the virtues are, is this really a solid basis for our ethical lives? Since the Second World War, there's been a revival of interest in virtue ethics. This goes back to the article by Anscombe, Elizabeth Anscombe, called Modern Moral Philosophy. And a philosopher called Alistair MacIntyre as well has also contributed to this debate with his book After Virtue. These philosophers, I think, find in virtue theory a way through a somewhat dry debate that can characterize the discussion between Kantians on the one hand, who are very absolutist, very definite, very based in principle, and utilitarians on the other, which are all about consequences, looking for what brings the greatest effect, what brings the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Virtue theory is really something fresh to that debate. Although it goes back thousands of years, it does bring something fresh and new in its emphasis on the emotions and its ability to make us think about the whole of our lives as an arena of ethical activity. One recent virtue theorist, Rosalind Hursthouse, talks about how virtue ethics can indeed be applied to practical issues, and she uses the example of abortion. But her main point really is that a virtuous person thinks differently. A virtuous person looks upon the world in a different way. And by thinking through virtue ethics and trying to understand how a virtuous person would see a situation, we find that the theory, far from being irrelevant, is something that can be useful in guiding our own lives.